series called Sacred Stories, and we have this week and next week. Today I'm going to be talking about the burning bush, and next week my dad's going to finish up with the story of Satan. So that'll get you. That's a good anchor leg right there. So make sure you're here next week. Then we'll get into a new series in the month of October. So the story of the burning bush, I think, is if you've been around church any amount of time, you're very familiar with this story. And beyond that, I think if you've been around church, or even if you're here today, my guess is that in some way, to some degree, your desire is to be very close to God. I don't think you just wake up on a Sunday morning and decide to go to church without an inkling of at least a desire to be closer to God. It may not be something that is a driving force. It may not be something that your life is centered around, but at some point, at some level, there is this push or desire to be close to God. And a lot of times we have this idea of what that means, of what it looks like and how we can be close to God. But I want to talk a little bit this morning about this story from Moses' life that may give us a little bit of a different perspective on really what it means to really be that close to God, to really be so close that it kind of radiates who you are. So this story comes from Exodus chapter 3, and we're going to read a few verses here in a moment. If you want to, open your Bible, or if you want to use the Pew Bible, it's, I think, page 43 there. But we'll get to that in just a moment from this story. Let me just set it up a little bit. Again, a lot of you may be familiar with this, but this is maybe just a refresher course. So Exodus chapter 3 is kind of relatively towards the start of the Bible. And at this point in time, Moses has been a shepherd for about 40 years or so. He's 80 years old in total. Now, the nation of Israel at this point is not really a nation that is thriving. The nation right at this point is being held hostage in Egypt. They're basically slaves to the Egyptians. And for 400 years, they've been in this situation. All of the stuff where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph has happened before this point. And now over the course of a few hundred years, this population of Israel has grown within the nation of Egypt, and they are now slaves. Well, they realize that they are God's people. So in their desperation, they reach out to God. They call out to God, desperate for some help. They want to be free people. And God does not turn a deaf ear to that, but he kind of listens to it, and he decides now to take some action to free his people from bondage, to provide a sense of freedom. So in Exodus 3, this is kind of the backdrop. An 80-year-old man out there wandering as a shepherd, millions of Jewish people being enslaved by Egypt, God hearing their cries. And so now as Moses is out here wandering around, this is kind of the backdrop for what happens in Exodus chapter 3. So let's just read. I just want to read 12 verses of this, and this will give you kind of the gist of the story of what's going on here. So in chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God." So he's just out there doing his normal son-in-law duties, which is to take care of his father-in-law's flock around this area, which is Mount Horeb. Verse 2, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed." And verse 3, I've always found somewhat humorous. "And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned." I mean, who talks to themselves like that? I would be freaking out at the moment instead of having this literary conversation with myself. But anyway, he turns and he says, "I will check this out and see why the bush does not burn." So verse 4, "When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, 'Moses, Moses.' And Moses replied, 'Here I am.' Verse 5, then he said, do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Verse 7, then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Ammonites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Verse 10, come, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, but I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So pretty straightforward story here. God hears the cry of the people. He has a plan. He sees Moses. He comes to Moses in this burning bush. Moses sees it, and they have this conversation. Moses says, hey, I'm here. And God says, listen, I've heard my people's cry. I've heard the oppression that is happening with my people. And I've got a plan. I've got a plan to lead them out of Egypt and lead them to this land that he calls flowing with milk and honey, which we know as the promised land. And he says, here's the key part of this story. You're going to do it. You're going to do it. You're the man I have chosen to lead the people out of Egypt. And so Moses is kind of taken back a little bit, and he's like, who am I? Who am I to do this? And God says, listen, I'll be with you. The story then goes into God demonstrating who he was. And if you were here on Wednesday nights, this is where the word Yahweh, the name for God, comes into play a little bit later when Moses asks, hey, who should I said sent me? And he says, Yahweh, I am who I am. So here we have this what I would look at as this crossroads in Moses' life, where God has decided to utilize Moses for something incredible. And now Moses, in reaction to this, he really has kind of a decision to make. God comes to him and says, listen, I'm going to use you. I need you to lead the people out of Egypt. And so now Moses has this decision. So what does Moses do? Moses starts to revert back, and he starts to look at this point in time, and he starts to kind of give God the reasons as to why God is making a bad decision. The reason as to why this is not a good idea. So at this point in time, right here, 80 years old, Moses decides to tell God about the past. Because he says, kind of, listen, God, I'm not sure if you know why this is a bad idea. I need you to know why I am not a good pick to lead the people out of Egypt. So why should God have never chosen Moses? Well, there should be an asterisk by this, because it should be why God should never have chosen Moses according to Moses. Because here comes Moses with a lot of this stuff that basically is argumentative against God as to why God should not choose him. Now, some of these you may relate with, because all they have to do with is Moses' past and who the person Moses is and who the person Moses was and why Moses should not be the person God has chosen. So he says basically, who am I? I mean, do you know who I am? Now, why is this a mistake? Well, first of all, because Moses wasn't really a true identity of an Israelite to its purest sense. If you remember the story of Moses, Moses was kind of half Israelite, half Jew. He was raised as a prince the first 40 years of his life. And even there was some squabbling among the people, say, who are you? Because here you are, this Egyptian, but he wasn't really Egyptian. So he's got this confused identity about him. Not only that, but this guy was a murderer. a murderer. At one point, his rage got a hold of him where he saw somebody, an Egyptian, mistreating an Israelite. So his rage kicked in and he killed somebody. I mean, to me, I don't know, that seems like a pretty big thing to have in your history. I mean, how many of us would be, hey, we got a new church leader, don't worry about the murder rap, the rest of them's pretty good. I mean, think about it. This is why God made a mistake. You've got a person who has no clue who he is, confused. You've also got a guy who has some major anger issues. And these just don't go away, by the way. He also comes in, he says, well, you know, I've got some issues. I don't talk very well. I'm not very eloquent. Some say he was like a stutterer. And he starts kind of naming these excuses as to why he's just not the kind of person that God should be choosing. You know, if you want somebody who's going to go in before Pharaoh, I would think you would want somebody who has a very eloquent, strong voice and who has a persona about them, a good presence. And it's just, she's like, dude, I've been with the sheep for 40 years. I mean, I'm starting to, I don't know about you, but I'm starting to side with Moses on this. Because it's like, do you see this guy? Not to mention, he's 80. Nothing against 80-year-olds, but come on. I mean, here's all these issues that are starting to pile up. Not to mention, he's been out of the game for a while. For the first 40 years, yeah, he was a prince. It would make sense to come to him at that point. But now for 40 years, he's been out of the game. He also has some kind of family issues, relational problems. A little bit later, we're going to learn how he kind of messed things up with God, and his wife had to come to his rescue in a very traumatic way. And if you don't know what that is, I'd encourage you to read Exodus 4, kind of verse 24-ish. Not right now, but... But his wife Zipporah has to kind of rescue him. So he's got these kind of relational issues that are, you know, who knows? It may not be working well. In that particular scene in Exodus chapter 4, also, it seems like he didn't quite follow God's law exactly the way he should have. And that kind of led to this relational issue that is mentioned because he forgot to circumcise his son, which was kind of a big deal back then. So here he is with all of these reasons why God should never have chosen Moses. He's got anger issues, he's got relational issues, he's got a rap sheet, he can't talk. He's been talking to wildlife for the past 40 years. He's out of commission, he's old, he's got all of these issues. I mean, come on, at this point, I'm with Moses. You got the wrong person. I mean, if I was choosing someone, I would not choose someone like this. And yet God says to him, no, you're the man. And he starts to give him all of these things that give him some credibility. But the main thing that gives him the credibility is the name of God, where he says, I am is with you. Because it's not really about you, it's about me. So we're at this turning point here. And Moses comes and he has this decision to make. Am I going to follow God and listen to God, or am I going to drift off into my past? Am I going to drift off into my excuses? Am I going to drift off into these things that really make sense? Or am I going to trust God? Now, God at this point, while Moses was focused on the past, God instead was focused on the future. Because God says to Moses at this point, well, here's what's going to happen. And so from Exodus chapter 3 onward through the next couple chapters, we read how Moses does come into play and how he does actually accept this challenge. And God gives him the ability, through God's power, to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And this is where we get the 10 plagues from. And this is actually where the connection from what we just did with communion is first found in the book of Exodus, where the Passover, where the death angel passes over because the blood was spilled. So in this chapter 3, God is starting to give him all of these considerations to take into account as to why this is going to work. And in verse 12, he comes back and he says this, and this is often missed. A lot of times we focus on Yahweh and I am who I am, which is excellent, and all of these different aspects. But this one seems to be overlooked, where he says in verse 12, God says, "But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." This mountain at the time is Mount Horeb. It's also known as Mount Sinai. And at this moment in Exodus chapter 3, this is the place that Moses is taking care of Jethro, his father-in-law's flock. This is just the natural place. So at this moment, he's there as this shepherd who has this past, who has all of these failures, who has all of this junk, who has all of this rap sheet, who has all of these things. And God says to him, the sign will be that I have done these things. When you come back to this mountain, when you come back to this point, you're going to be with a lot of people who are worshiping me. Now, this Mount Horeb, the importance of this Mount Horeb, to me, it can't really be underestimated, because what it shows is here is Moses in this place, in this context of his life. And God is making him a promise where he says, listen, when you come back to this place, it's not going to be that everything is gone. You're still going to have all of these failures. You're still going to stutter. You're still going to have the murder back there. You're still going to be filled with rage and anger. But there's going to be something different about you. You're going to come full circle back to where now you are a shepherd wandering, and you're going to come back as a leader, leading people to worship me. And so as the story unfolds, the 10 plagues come and the people go out of Egypt. They hit the Red Sea. You've seen the story where they parted the Red Sea, and they end up at Mount Sinai, which is Mount Horeb. So in Exodus chapters 19 through about 34, there is this part where we read Moses coming back to this very mountain that he started in. Except he's not leading a bunch of sheep now. He's leading millions of Jewish people into worship. And now all of a sudden, he's not known as this failure. He's not known as this person who can't get it together. He's not known as this person who is kind of always carrying all the burdens. He's known as the leader that God has chosen to lead millions of people to worship God. And it's the sign that God gives that says, listen, and you see what's going to happen. It's going to come full circle to the point where you are going to realize that all of this is bringing you closer to me. So in Exodus chapter 20, we get the 10 Commandments. And there's some issues that go on with the 10 Commandments, and Moses comes down the mountain, but then he goes back up for a while. And in Exodus chapter 34, he has spent so much time with God, So much time face to face with God that when he comes down the mountain, his face is radiating God. The people are freaked out by this. They're freaked out. So he has to put a veil over his face because he is so much radiating God. So here's the progression of Moses. Murderer, anger issues, failures, stutterer, all of these things. He's radiating God so much that he has to hide it. I mean, so let me ask us. Like I said at the beginning, do we have a desire, I think we do at some point, to get to the point where we are radiating God? Radiating God. Now, I don't think your face is going to glow, okay? If it is glowing, okay, but we're going to take you to the hospital rather than put a napkin over your face. So we're not talking about that. But what I am kind of asking us is the question that when we go among the people, are we radiating the Spirit of God so much that it is so recognizable as somebody's face glowing? You see, for Moses, this was a transition that happened at this burning bush. It was the crossroads. Once he hit that crossroad, from there, the past turned into the future. The failure turned into the radiating God. The question I always have is, what's the turning point? What's the turning point here? How did he move from this particular person where he was almost embarrassed by his past? He was almost embarrassed by who he was to a person that was radiating God to that degree. Now, if you look at the life of Moses, if you look at his life, it's kind of split up into three sections, 40 years, and 40 years. And people kind of talk about it being 40 years being a prince. The next 40 years, he was a shepherd. And then the final 40 years, he was the leader. So here we have this first 40 years where he was a prince, and at the end of this 40 years is when he murders the guy, and so he becomes a fugitive. He marries Zipporah and becomes the shepherd of Jethro's people. And so he's wandering out in that area. So you have 40, 40, and 40. And sometimes people have kind of labeled these sections as the first 40 years as kind of the prince, the next 40 years is kind of preparation, and then the next 40 years as actually performing or actually leading God's people. But this middle 40 years, I have a problem personally with the idea of it being preparation, okay? And I'm gonna tell you why I have the problem with it being preparation. He was not prepared to meet God. Because all of this 40 years of preparation, all it did was lead him to the point where he was mulling over what had been taking place in his past. For 40 years, look at what I did. I'm a fugitive. Oh, my life could be so much better if I wouldn't have done this. Oh, my life would be so much better if I could just talk right. Oh, my life would be so much better if I could figure out just who I really was, if I could find myself. This was not preparation from what I see in Exodus 3, because he was full of excuses as to why God should not use him. And yet, here he is for 40 years mulling around in this kind of thought process. Let me ask you, if you were out on a hill for 40 years watching sheep, what would that do for your mental health? I mean, I have trouble sometimes just being alone for a couple hours because I start talking to myself. And before long, I'm mulling over things. I'm creating scenarios. I'm doing all these things in my head that kind of lead me to these non-reality places. And for 40 years, he's been kind of just sitting back, taking it all in. And my guess is, this isn't in scripture, but my guess is at this point, he probably got to the point of acceptance to think this is all it is. This is all it is. My life, I ruined it. I'm broken. I have too much weight. I have too much baggage. And at this point, all I need to do is just sit back and kind of allow God to minister to me. And what did it get him? Well, God, who am I? Who am I? You've been prepping for 40 years. So it's not the prep here that made the difference. If it was the prep here, things would have been a lot different in chapter 3 here. But the change was the fact that Moses decided to step out of that into a place that he was uncomfortable with, to follow God and to take action and to actually lead. To actually lead. And when he did that, all of a sudden things began to change in his life, which began to make God a real force, so much so that he was the man in Exodus chapter 20, which was pretty much the only one who stood up for God, and eventually got to the point where God's face was radiated through him. Now, let me in the few minutes we have kind of bring this back into more of a practical place of where we are in our culture, in our society. Now remember, the goal here is to radiate God, okay? That's the goal. The goal here is to be close to God, so close that when people see us, we radiate who he is. So in this scenario, we have Moses, who is sitting at one point, who is prepping, if you want to call it that, who's just out there minding his own business, being ministered, being comforted, being whatever before God. Then we have Moses, who stepped out and took some major action. In our culture, in our society, and specifically in Western Christianity, Christianity over the years has migrated to this point where, generally speaking, the qualifications of really being a Christ follower has been show up to church. If you ask generally people, are you a Christian? Well, yeah, what's their first word? I go to church, or I try to go to church, or I go on Christmas and Easter. This is the mark. This is the baseline that Western Christianity has had, or has at this point. And the mentality basically is that if I go to church, if I give God, an hour and a half a week, that kind of gets me into that place where I'm a Christian. Let me be clear, and let me also be politically correct, I guess. I don't know. Coming and sitting in church will never get you to the point where you radiate God. It won't do it. What has happened is Christianity has kind of flowed into this place where you've heard of consumerism, Christianity, where the church has become a place where we come for decades, and many people just sit back and they'll critique it like they critique a movie. Did I get something out of that message? Was that good? Did I like the music? Did this person, were they nice to me? All of these things, which is basically consumer Christianity. And this is really the prep stage of Moses. We're going to just sit and be ministered to. Give me, help me. Give me more. I want to know, I want to feel God's presence. Speak to me. I want to feel the worship. I want to feel this. I want to feel that. And for Moses, this only took him so far. Because at that point, it was never enough for him to radiate God to a people that needed to be led. Every one of us are at some point, and I believe more often than quicker than we think we are, come to this point where we are in front of a burning bush, where God says to us, I want you to get out and I want you to lead. And you may be thinking, I don't lead. Yeah, you do lead. You lead your family. You lead your coworkers. You lead your friends. You lead the people that God has put in your circle that allow you to radiate God to them. But we don't radiate if we don't take on the mantle of saying, I am going to take this on and I will be the person to lead. Instead, if we just sit, if we just consume, if we just take the step back and look at it from what can I get from it, it's going to lead us to the point where all we can see are excuses. All we can see is the past. All we can see are our failures. All we can see are the reasons as to why we can't do this, why we can't do that. The reason is because I got a pass, I did this, I'm not that. Well, we're all in that category. Every one of us. I came to this church 8 years ago. 8 years ago. And I sat for a while. I sat and just thought, like Moses, I got the past. I screwed it up, got the baggage. I'm just one of those statistics. I'm just going to sit, be ministered unto, and let the comfort of God overwhelm me. You know what happened during that time? It was about a year and a half. It just became so blah. It just became something that just became like, oh, we're just going to go through the cycle of this. And it wasn't until finally I was asked to do something, and it was kind of a burning bush moment for me. And to be honest, there were excuses. I don't think so. Let me tell you as to why God should not choose me. Now, I don't want you to get the thought that I figured this all out. But what I did realize is that you and I, any one of us, can disqualify ourselves. Any one of us. And yet, for those of you who have stepped out from that and realized that it's not just about what you're taking in, but it's also about what you're giving out, is where you're going to start to realize the full radiance of God in your life. And many of us sit back and we think that it's just going to happen, But the scripture is consistently clear that our job is not to be ministered unto, but to minister to. Now, all of a sudden, you're probably filled with a lot of excuses at this point. Some of you are thinking, well, I can't get up and I can't speak on a Sunday morning. Okay. But what can you do? Because you can do something. Can you lead in your circle with a great attitude? Can you lead in your circle with the fruit of the Spirit? Can you lead in your circle with a trust in God that radiates who He is? You see, I think most of us come to this moment of a burning bush. I think many of us ignore it. Think it's, oh, that's not my bush, that's your bush. But I want you to hear me. I really want you to hear me. If you want to be that close to God and radiate him, it's got to be more than just taking it in an hour a week. Moses spent days on top of that mountain with God. He went out of his comfort zone. He took on the responsibility. He took on the challenge of becoming something more than his past. God said to him, listen, here's going to be the sign. You're going to come back to here. Everything's going to look the same, but the difference is going to be you're going to be different. And he was. And so my challenge here this morning is for you to just kind of be honest with yourself. You don't have to be honest with me. Be honest with yourself and honest with God about where you are. At what point does it become a change? At what point does it move from the preparation and the feeling good and the healing into the fact to realize that part of that is associated with leading others? And some of you are kind of on this maybe on this brink to where you're kind of stuck maybe in your relationship with God. You don't know what to do. Well, let me just suggest maybe you look to God for him to lead you to where you can make a difference, because you can. Every one of us can. Don't get caught in the excuses. Don't get caught in stepping back and say, well, God, you've made a huge, huge mistake. Because there's one thing I do know. Even if I've, said some things that aren't right, I will say one thing that I do know. God does not make mistakes. And he didn't make a mistake with you.